Welcome all of you to our webinar series on science and human rights, co-organized by the Science and Human Rights Coalition of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Movement Engaged Research Hub of the Center for Social Science Research at George Mason University. Today's topic is AI and the rise of digital repression. I'm John Dale, Director of the Movement Engaged Research Hub and Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at George Mason. I'll be your moderator. And we are delighted to have with us today Stephen Feldstein. He is Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. His research focuses on technology and politics, U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and the global context for democracy and human rights. Stephen is the author of The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. It was the recipient of the 2023 Graumeyer Award for Ideas Improving the World, or Improving World Order. This webinar will examine the interplay between artificial intelligence technology, surveillance practices, and global governance norms. AI technology has extended the power of states to track citizens due to advances in biometric identification systems, social media monitoring, and predictive policing techniques, while entrenched autocracies are making eager use of these new capacities. More open political systems are also incorporating these tools, raising troubling questions about the impact on due process, free expression, and active citizenship. How will the growing availability of AI technologies impact democratic governance, fuel repressive practices, or undermine the rule of law? The answer depends on efforts by international organizations, national governments, civil society groups, and the wider global community to craft new norms around AI. What those norms look like and how they will shape existing practice and future innovation is hotly debated. Participants today will come away with a better understanding about the stakes involved in these conversations and the ensuing policy implications. We'll begin with Stephen's presentation. He'll probably talk to us for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will begin to ask questions. I'll probably have a couple of questions, and Karthik Ramanujam will too, who helped us set everything up for this webinar, and I'd like to thank him. Then we will open up to the broader audience. You will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Use that rather than the chat to send us your questions. And we will also be recording this webinar, and you'll find a link to it in the chat to access it later. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Stephen.
Great. Well, thanks for the warm welcome, John. I really appreciate it, and thanks to George Mason and the Center for Social Science Research for hosting me for this talk. I'm excited to kind of delve into some of these issues. I have been thinking about them for a long time, but I find that the field is so dynamic, and there are so many new issues to consider that I really do think that there is a lot on the table to think about, to parse through, to discuss. So I'm excited to sort of lay out some ideas that I have based on the research that I've done for the book and subsequently, and then more recent developments, particularly linked to issues like generative AI, and then engage in a dialogue in a Q&A and hear some of what's on your mind, and see what kind of ideas we can discuss. So let me start. I have a presentation here. Let me share that, and we can kind of walk here. So AI and the rise of digital repression. So I think, as I mentioned, there's been a whirlwind of new developments related to artificial intelligence this year, and it can be a little bit hard to make sense of it all. And I think it's useful to break down more precisely what specific technologies and associated harms of concern, And I think one of the goals for this talk, at least, is to offer a framework to better understand and figure out how to wrestle with some of these issues as well as potential responses. So I really want to focus my talk in three areas here. I want to start by talking about AI in the digital repression context, and this very much sort of builds off ideas in my book in terms of particularly the kind of AI and surveillance questions that are around. Next, I want to talk about global governments and global norms. In other words, what are countries around the world, what are international organizations doing to put in place safeguards and more common understandings when it comes to associated harms and objectives linked to artificial intelligence technology. And this will build in part on a forthcoming paper that I have in Democratization Journal that specifically looks at the European Union's AI Act and efforts to build a kind of global normative agenda around its key components. And then finally, given the kind of massive amount of discussion surrounding generative AI, particularly large language models, there are new developments and societal considerations I think are very critical to all these questions about how we will govern ourselves and how technology links to oppression. So I want to take some time to kind of walk through that. And this part is really new in terms of material that I've kind of recently put together. So I'll be curious to get feedback on that as well. So let's start with the first, this is the first question, AI in the digital repression context. So in my book, I outline a range of technologies harnessed by leaders for political purposes, everything from surveillance strategies to censorship techniques to disinformation and so forth. And one of the cross-cutting technologies I profiled in the book is artificial intelligence, and really kind of focused on how artificial intelligence enhances surveillance. And so, what do we know at this point? And what was established? Well, we know a few things. That we know that when algorithms, advanced algorithms, are combined with biometric systems like facial recognition, it can help identify individuals of interest in a crowd. We know that algorithms can allow operators to monitor mass amounts of information, looking for suspicious patterns or dissenting speech. We know that whether or not artificial intelligence systems are fully operational, there is enough of a chilling effect that they have that it serves as a de facto suppressant when it comes to dissent, when it comes to the ability of people to freely communicate with one another, particularly in coercive environments. And so there's some associated advantages with AI systems when it comes to surveillance. They offer greater capabilities than comparable strategies, and especially with with continued increases in computing power, systems will continue to enhance even further. AI systems are always on. So unlike physical repression counterparts in the past, they don't suffer from fatigue or inattention, while they aren't fully autonomous yet. That potentially is on the horizon. AI systems also help solve principal agent problems in a sense of when you have large amounts of people who are conscripted to serve as your eyes and ears to enact surveillance objectives. That can also bring problems when it comes to loyalty. With AI systems, that loyalty issue is somewhat solved. It's a machine that's undertaking the bidding of the operator in question. And then there's a cost efficiency argument as well, that especially when attempting to monitor mass amounts of data and information across different information streams and large societies, the Chinese authorities and their approaches are a good case in point. Having to do the equivalent in terms of traditional surveillance, physical surveillance, such as we saw, in East Germany with the Stasi, would be inordinately more expensive. And so, while there is, I think, while there is a significant investment, capital expenditure required to run these systems, when you look at kind of using them at scale amongst large populations, there tends to be a cost efficiency associated with them as well. But they're not perfect, and they don't exist, or they don't work well for all societies. They require cohesive command and control when it comes to the functioning of security forces. They require sufficient capacity, capabilities, and resources to leverage appropriately. So when you have all those elements in place, or you have close to it, they can be extremely effective, and if not transformational, in terms of allowing a very finely tuned ability for states to monitor and track information about citizens. But when you don't have it, they're a tool that can do very little. In fact, in some ways, can be a distraction from other strategies. So they're not a panacea. It really does depend on context. Now, where are the hotspots when it comes to where these tools are being used? So certainly, China is a global AI repression leader, and techniques honed in Xinjiang, as well as in safe cities across the country, have served as a real modeling for other countries, other regimes, other municipalities that are interested in enacting some similar techniques. Other authoritarian countries and even weaker democracies have experimented quite a bit with using these tools, and it's become fairly ubiquitous. Although, as I want to emphasize, actual practice in terms of effectiveness of use does vary. But we see all sorts of anecdotal evidence, at least, of facial recognition used in Moscow's metros to pick up protesters, anti-war protesters. We see the burgeoning amount of safe cities and facial recognition systems being implemented in weaker democracies like India, Pakistan, Thailand, and other places. And so, one of the questions I've really tried to unpack is to look at and understand better the proliferation of AI surveillance systems around the world. And what I've had, somewhat rough, is that at least 97 countries around the world have been documented to deploy public AI surveillance techniques. So I'm going to here. So if you look at this next slide here, and this comes from a paper I published subsequent to my book last year for the National Endowment for Democracy that talks about the kind of struggle for regarding global AI surveillance. This breaks down the kind of distribution of the 97 countries I mentioned in terms of who is deploying these systems. And as you can see, going from very sharp green on the left, liberal democracies, to darker blue, closed autocracies, there's a fairly even mix in split when it comes to the regime types. And so, in other words, AI surveillance systems are certainly not used uniformly when it comes to different types of countries between democracies and autocracies, but they are distributed fairly uniformly. In other words, while there may not be the same types of abuses associated with using these systems in democracies, that's not to say that democracies still aren't using the systems, period. And so if you look at that number, I think 52 countries out of the 97 are classified as democratic, either electoral democracies, which is sort of like weaker democracies, like Brazil or Mexico or South Africa, or liberal democracies, like your classic European liberal democracies, Australia, United States, and so forth. And one I want to also mention is that while we tend to focus on the most extreme use cases, and a lot of times they revolve around examples in China. In fact, even at home, we have the presence of large amounts of AI-powered surveillance taking place. So a good example that I like to use is to look at the U.S. border. In the U.S. border, according to recent reports, we have at least 9 Predator drones operated by Customs and Border Patrol. We have 55 integrated fixed towers. So these are 120 to 180-foot surveillance systems equipped with infrared cameras and built-in radar. They're built by a company named Anduril, which has been very active in this space. And Anduril has come up with a system, an AI system called Lattice, to autonomously identify, detect, and track objects of interest. Cameras can pan 360 degrees and can detect a human from 2.8 kilometers away. So, what kind of controls do we have? What kind of oversight do we have when it comes to different individuals who are tracked, let alone data that's collected? I'm not sure myself. And this is in a liberal democracy where there is a fair degree of openness and accountability. So you think about that in a place where there's less of that of the rule of law in place, and it certainly raises even greater concerns. So the point being is that there are concerning uses in democracies as well as autocracies. But we do have to be careful not to overstate the case in terms of how they're used in democracies versus the very coercive uses in authoritarian states. And one of the areas for me that I think is particularly important is what I term global swing states, where I think the struggle for how these systems are used could go either way. And this was, as I mentioned, this slide comes in the report. But in that report, I specifically looked at this issue. And what I did was I identified 67 digital swing states. So I essentially used varieties of democracy index. I used their electoral democracy scores, and I kind of picked a swath of countries that scored below liberal democracies, but above sort of closed autocracies, essentially ranging from the high end Jamaica to the low end Malaysia. And all these states combine different democratic traits with autocratic attributes. And they all suffer from a mix of democratic weakness. So you have concentrated power in the executive branch, lack of judicial independence, and media freedom concerns. And so this right here, I like maps and charts. This shows you of the swing states, the breakdown. So 44 of the 67 swing states I looked at have evidence of public AI surveillance. And so those are the ones, with the darker kind of color are those digital swing states. Actually, sorry, the ones with the lighter color, no, the ones with the darker color are the ones that have public AI surveillance. The ones with the lighter color do not. And so that kind of shows you the breakdown, but it really kind of cuts across regions pretty well. Now, of all these groups, 55 are members of the Belt and Road Initiative, and so there's certainly a strong, I think, push when it comes to equipment that is sourced from China. But it's not only just China as well. I'll talk about that in a second. And there's a varied amount of use as well. So one of the places I mentioned, Pakistan, is a place that has evidence of public AI surveillance. But there's been a lot of studies that have kind of looked more closely at how these systems are used in that country. And what it's actually found is that the systems often are sort of marginally operational. There's a lot of problems in terms of actually taking data collected and sort of doing anything actionable with it. And so it's much more for show. What one contact I interviewed in my book would describe as security theater, or kind of elements behind, Michel Foucault's the panopticon, and that the perception that one is being watched can oftentimes be sufficient in terms of doing surveillance, even if the reality of being watched is not completely there. So it's an interesting sort of question. Now, when it comes to supply and technology, as I mentioned, companies from China are popular suppliers, but companies in the OECD, based in the OECD countries, are also major players. I think that, in terms of kind of understanding the balance and dynamic from China, you certainly get a lot of modeling in terms of how these systems can be used. You get subsidized components that make it affordable for countries that otherwise would be less reluctant or less able to purchase these systems to actually acquire them. And you also have robust marketing of these products. Huawei, ZTE, and others have been pretty aggressive in terms of getting meetings with different government officials and talking about what their products can do. So there's no question that has had an influence. But I think we also have to be careful not to overstate the influence of China either when it comes to these systems. So there are a lot of push-pull factors in line. If the pushing factors are the kind of supply side China related side, the pull factors also matter. So what are pull factors? It relates to the agency of countries themselves, the political incentives that regimes have when it comes to making determinations about whether they want to acquire these systems and what they want to do with them. So it's not just about China being in the game. It is also about the very specific incentives that countries have about whether they want to attain these systems. So, take Uganda as a good case in point. Uganda is the system where there's been reported that or is a country where it was reported a few years ago that the regime purchased a safe city system for Kampala that was subsequently used against the opposition ahead of national elections. Now, was this something that was simply a matter of China pushing the system, or were there other political incentives in mind, particularly President Museveni's desire to rig elections and suppress the opposition as needed in order to guarantee another term in office. I would say the latter, in which case then, the idea that this simply being a China-oriented strategy of surveillance or digital authoritarianism doesn't really kind of get you to the full picture. So what can we do about these trends? And then this really takes us kind of to the global governance, global norms question, or the second part of this talk. So there really is a challenge, I think, between a mismatch between innovation and regulation. And regulations have not kept pace, whether in the United States or more globally. I mean, the good news is that there are growing signs of consolidation. So we see, at least at a high level, in different fora. So the OECD, as well as UNESCO, have done a lot in terms of releasing high-level AI principles linked to trustworthy AI, designed to shape ethics and practice. There are at least now 175 countries, firms who have produced documents listing ethical principles for AI. There's, of course, the actual enforceable legislative hard law process taking place in the European Union at the moment with the AI Act. And you also have in the United States kind of a growing number of documents that remain fairly abstract, but are starting to kind of push the conversation in more concrete directions, including a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights in the United States, as well as NIST risk management framework for AI. So how do we understand the AI governance landscape? Is there a way to kind of divide out and think about how it is organized? And I think some would argue that you are seeing the emergence of sort of three contested areas centered around the United States, around China, and kind of more authoritarian practices in Europe. But I think this is too reductive. I think that's too simple in terms of looking at things. I think for one, it leaves out states like India, India, Brazil, and Russia, which are making pretty important strides in terms of coming up with their own mix of technologies and uses of AI systems. Now, I think one of the questions will be that despite this kind of given this fragmented landscape, will we see signs of consolidation behind any of the blocks or groups of countries or markets where governance developments are starting to move? And I think that some think that the EU in particular is one place that will continue to kind of lead and shape regulation in the AI space. And I think there's some arguments that are in favor of that. The EU is a first mover when it comes to regulations, and that can bring about a sticky impact. It has a large consumer base that allows for solidifying de facto and de jure influence when it comes to AI norms. And in terms of kind of near peer competitors, the US remains pretty far behind. And there's also a shared consensus with the US in a lot of core areas, which means that there might be a less of an incentive for the US to pivot to its own set of ideas away from at least some aspects of the AIA. However, I think there's also some questions about the degree to which the European push will really set the standard for safeguards and different ethical principles when it comes to AI. I think for one, there's some big design and implementation concerns when it comes to the AIA's tiered risk framework that so far it looks like it's coming into place in terms of having different types of technologies, AI-linked technologies being put into first, second, third categories of potential risk. And that can also lead to future-proof problems. So we're already seeing some debate right now about to what extent should generative AI systems be put into higher risk categories. And so it is very difficult ex ante to make determinations about how different systems will work, what kind of harms will result when we simply don't know exactly what will emanate. And while Europe's large consumer market does provide enough leverage to offset lagging, does provide leverage when it comes to having a big market, so the market purchasing power, logic. On the other hand, the biggest AI companies, the center of innovation resides elsewhere in the United States and China, not in Europe. And so, I mean, even if you look at the generative AI kind of explosion now, where is Europe when it comes to that? And I think there's also questions about whether AI technology itself is conducive to extending what has been popularly termed at this point the Brussels effect. Kind of linked to what Brussels was able to do when it comes to privacy standards and GDPR. The argument being that the Brussels effect might also extend to AI governance. But because AI is something where there's more of an ability to have market differentiation, so essentially to have different rules associated with AI products in different markets. So rather than having a Brussels effect that might extend globally, you could have a Brussels effect that simply stays within Brussels and different standards that apply elsewhere around the world. So I think, ultimately we'll see a little bit of both. I think most likely we'll see a convergence between the EU and the US on core issues, with the EU exhibiting some sway as a first mover, but significant equities relating to the US due to its industry leadership in innovation. And I think we'll see, but I think the jury's out, and there's a lot more left on this stage, and a lot more left to debate. So that takes me to kind of the third part then, what to make about generative AI and large language models. Now, I think, generative AIs bring a host of unpredictable, if not troubling implications, alongside also exciting possibilities. And certainly progress, I think, has outpaced expectations and certainly outpaced regulations. So, a good starting point is, what are we talking about? What do we mean by generative AI? What is it? What makes it different? And generative AI, broadly speaking, is a set of algorithms that are capable of generating seemingly new, realistic content, text, images, audio, from training data. Now, most of the most powerful algorithms are built on top of foundation models that are trained on vast quantities of unlabeled data to identify underlying patterns that can be then used for a wide range of tasks. And the capabilities sort of, fit into a few categories. So one is to generate content and ideas. So you can create new, unique outputs from whether it's video ads, music, molecular compounds with different properties. Second is efficiency gains. These large language models can really accelerate the ability to fulfill manual and repetitive tasks. And then three is personalization. They allow for curated content, targeted ads at a mass scale, customized experience, all of which I think can really change the nature of how information is consumed and really how our economies function. Now, I want to, because this talk is generally focused on democratic challenges and repressive concerns linked to AI, I really want to talk about 4 areas of concern and the potential implications. As I was sort of thinking a lot about in the last week about where are we most worried when it comes to the potential effect that generative AI models will take us. I really kind of focused in on four areas, and I'll walk through each one of those. So let's start with undermining democracy, kind of broadly. There are concerns that LLMs, large language models, will bring catastrophe and civilizational collapse, certainly by some people. There was a recent op-ed in the Financial Times by venture capitalist entrepreneur Ian Hogarth, entitled "We Must Slow Down the Race to Godlike AI." And really talks about the fact that this kind of leads to the idea that this will soon take over all aspects of society, and we will lose the ability to be able to control and make decisions when it comes to how these systems operate. That we are kind of giving away the store in that sense. Now, that sort of tends to be the kind of far end side, the alarmist side, and I'm less convinced about that scenario, though I wouldn't completely dismiss it out of hand either. What I'm more concerned about is what an author named Hans Bajor calls the democratic disaster scenario in a recent piece that he wrote. And the idea here is that the privatization of language technologies will have drastic effects when it comes to the political public sphere. So you have the danger of creating new oligopolies that concentrate tech even more so in a few private companies. We're already seeing that in terms of the most widely used, kind of underlying models that are in place. That these companies will serve as gatekeepers who will decide the future of opinion forming and political deliberation. And that we can expect that large language models will begin to exert influence on broader culture and society. And what if they generate political manifestos or visions that broad groups begin to follow? Without having some degree of public control, this can lead to a pretty dangerous scenario. And we've already seen how disastrous it has been when it comes to private companies overseeing large-scale communications and the the perverted incentive that result, particularly related to in social media. So imagine the scale and power of this dynamic multiplied exponentially. So that's something to watch. Second, propaganda and disinformation. So it doesn't take much imagination to consider the propaganda potential of generative AI systems. I think, one of the biggest advantages you get is that you have the ability to cheaply generate scalable content that is indistinguishable from human written text. But there's a problem of volume in the sense that you can produce almost a nearly unlimited supply of bad information, either to one, poison the well, which means that you can get it to a point where no one trusts any information because they can't tell whether it's true or false, or two, convince mass amounts of individuals on false grounds to follow or pursue particular political objectives, including conspiracy theories, all of which we've already seen. Now, you also have a problem of scaling and micro-targeting, which is both sort of, in some ways, it seems like it's contradictory, but actually kind of comes along quite well, in the sense that these systems can allow you to target vast numbers of people with tailored messaging linked to potentially subversive political agendas. It can be ideologically based, it can be linked to mercenary objectives, but either way, these extreme forms of personalization are things that are right around the corner, if not happening already. And then finally, there's this lowered barrier to entry problem as well, which is that it is becoming increasingly more cost effective and requires less and less capacity to establish propaganda centers, troll farms, and other sorts of centers with nefarious intent in mind, leveraging the power of large language models in which to put out this type of propaganda and disinformation. So that's something to watch. There's a good article in Foreign Affairs called "The Coming Age of AI-Powered Propaganda," which is worth a read. Third, cyber attacks and criminal use. So the same attributes that we talked about can also be applied towards hacking when it comes to bringing major disruptions. Now, I think LLMs already, we know, can be manipulated through prompt engineering and other sorts of practices to get them to generate malicious code and to help get around the safeguards that ostensibly are in place. And so what kind of examples of crime could we potentially foresee linked to large language models? Well, fraud and impersonation, certainly. LLMs can make this more authentic. It can happen faster. And most importantly, it can happen at a mass scale. So the thing with fraud is that even if you only fool 98% of the people, if you apply this at volume, that 2% can translate to quite a bit of people. And again, whether that's for profit-making motives or something far worse, either way, that ought to be of concern. It can also, large language models can also be used for code generation, so for hacking, intrusion operations. Already we've seen that these models can generate code faster and in more complex ways than any existing models prior to. And that safeguards, that are built in for, let's say, ChatGPT-3, only work when ChatGPT-3 knows what it's doing. So they can be tricked into doing criminal cyber work, such as creating malware. And what do individuals think about that? Well, Jen Easterly, director of CISA, when asked about how hackers can use AI tools in the future attacks, has said, quote, "I am really, really worried in a way that I've never been worried. And I used to deal with ISIS all the time, every day. We just don't know where this is going to end up. So I'm more worried than I've been in a long, long time about the downstream potential of the use of this technology by bad actors." So there's a really interesting, good report that came out in March 2023 on ChatGPT by Europol. I advise you to take a look at that if you're interested in this area. Finally, terrorism and war, geopolitics. So, there's a question about can large language models help proliferate, knowledge used for, let's say, weapons of mass destruction, like, putting together chemical weapons. And it looks like on that score, there are some factors that make it less likely, because one question we have to ask is research acquisition the biggest roadblock to WMD acquisition and use. And terrorist uses require lots of ingredients, and information acquisition is just one of many. On the other hand, I think what makes people concerned about how large language models could enable these type of activities is that there's lowered barriers to entry. and some oftentimes with terrorist acts, they are acts of opportunity. You know, could large language models create live shopping lists for weapons created? You know, help to source difficult to find disparate ingredients through hundreds of websites simultaneously? Can these models help generate, help find publicly accessible but difficult to find information, shortening the time that users need to spend on research and compiling information that is understandable to a non-expert user for catastrophic or certainly risky behavior? And then there's the whole question about war planning. Already we've seen in the Ukraine war, and something I've written about a little bit, about how AI has been essential to helping different actors organize in multiple streams of data to assist with targeting. And you can easily see large language models further move this process along when it comes to generating recommendations for military action, perhaps even autonomously when it comes to, you know, or kind of interacting with other autonomous weapons. So you have an autonomous targeting system interacting with autonomous loitering drones. And you can only imagine kind of the downside risks to that. So, you know, I did want to know, I did want to turn to an expert and ask directly, to what extent do large language models, does ChatGPT-3 threaten democracy? So I asked ChatGPT-3, and this is what ChatGPT-3 told me. You know, how can we stop large language models from destroying democracy? And so, you know, at least in terms of the answer I got back, it disclosed it has no intention or capability to destroy democracy or any other form of governance. And I asked this question several different ways, and certainly one of the things that it pinpointed a lot was the deep fakes, disinformation, propaganda question. So I guess of all the different things I mentioned, you know, perhaps the propaganda disinformation side is the one, at least for ChatGPT-3, that it or its creators or the internet in which it obtained its training data is most concerned with. So something to think about on that front. Last kind of point, and I want to wrap up, is that you know, there are lots of questions in terms of where we are in terms of the productivity cycle when it comes to generative AI. And you know, let's be very clear, we're just at the very beginning. And we look at the history of other technologies that have been put in use, and you know, this is it was a smart op-ed written by Paul Krugman a few weeks ago on this front. If you look at electrification, the productivity gains for electrification, there was certainly a lag that kicked in before it actually was able to be incorporated in different manufacturing processes. Likewise, was the first microprocessor that came out in 1971. You actually saw declines in productivity, you know, for 20, 30 years until you, or 20 years until you started to see a growth and sort of a peak around 2005. And so, you know, the point is that even when you have new innovations, and even when we're kind of in this more modern sort of cycle of innovation, it takes time for these processes to kind of embed themselves appropriately, for people to figure out how to use them, to properly harness them, to bring them, incorporate them in different economic processes. So, well, I certainly think that generative AI will be disruptive and will lead to lots of change. I also think that it is something that will happen over a period of time and it won't happen tomorrow. So, you know, we can go to bed easy, at least tonight. The world won't change tomorrow, although it may change soon. Let me sort of conclude here. I think in general, we're in a period of immense change when it comes to AI, and there's lots of uncertainty about how it will affect society, politics, and war. We're also coming at a fraught geopolitical juncture where the old structures, systems are breaking down and emerging orders have yet to establish. I do think, however, the world has learned a lot about digital governance, norms, and safeguards, and we're less likely to be caught unawares when it comes to the potential harms from the information ecosystem. And there's no guarantee that needed regulatory action will occur. So I think it's incumbent upon citizens to push for change, to hold political leaders accountable, to guard against abuses that emerge. And you know, I just want to emphasize, I think we're entering a very unpredictable and uncertain moment when it comes to these technologies. So let me stop here and turn it over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. This is a fascinating topic, and your research is amazing. I'm so glad you've joined us today. And I do have some questions for you, and I'd like to ask you a follow-up on this last point you made about innovation and sort of your sense that we should see increasing innovation moving forward. In contrast with the point you made at the beginning of your discussion on undermining democracy, the way that the concentration of control over AI within big tech firms has also been, in some ways, I guess we could say, stultifying our innovation. It's with this very insular vanguard, one that's not so inclusive, including more and more people to be innovating and using these technologies in a variety of ways. It seems like you've got a tension there that you're pointing to, and I'm interested in hearing about that. And I'll stop with that. I've got a follow-up question to that too.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking about that. And I think the way I think about it, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly how this all works, but if you look at the generative AI ecosystem, you can analogize it in some ways to kind of platforms and then the applications that are built on them. So in the application layer, which is where you have all sorts of different smaller entities that can come up with creative ideas and different things and ways in which to leverage these kind of underlying generative models, that's where you can really see innovation kind of take off. So it's that. So think about it this way, in the sense that like you had different applications that were built off, the iOS system for iPhones that were able to kind of allow for Uber or Airbnb or all these other kind of applications to bubble up. On the one hand, you can say like it's stultifying because it's just iOS and Android. And I agree with that. I think that it is problematic that you only have a very small handful that are sort of controlling the kind of entry point or gatekeeping, to these foundational models. On the other hand, it's also fair to acknowledge that at a different step, at a different layer, there is plenty of room to do lots of creative and innovative things. And we're already seeing that. So that's kind of how that sort of tension works a bit.
Okay. And you've been, pointing to the ways in which we might be seeing efforts to regulate. I think largely referring to, let's see, you mentioned UNESCO and OECD and 175 countries that are starting to develop some kind of policies around regulating AI, as well as, of course, the EU AI Act and the US blueprint for an AI Act. A lot of these efforts sound like governance regulatory efforts. I know we can't depend too much on big tech corporations right now. If we're reading the Financial Times over the last 2 weeks, we've seen how they're laying off all their AI ethicists as they prepare to cut costs and become more competitive to get their AI out there. You have Elon Musk, who said we should wait for 6 months, but many cynically interpret that to be pointing to the fact that his AI that he's been developing is 6 months behind the others, and maybe he's just buying himself time. But I'm wondering, do you see also a role for civil society actors in helping to regulate this emerging AI market and use by states like China? I guess you call this sort of a state surveillance versus state capitalist model. State capitalism, yes. I'm thinking in terms of Shoshana Zuboff's concept, where she too largely just looks at legal regulations, not so much our participation in civil society, say the role universities might play, for instance, in contributing to this.
Yeah, no, I would say that, legal regulations are almost nowhere without having the civil society component to them. I mean, especially right now, there's essentially what we're looking at as a vacuum, right? These high level governance frameworks in the OECD, they're non-binding, they're voluntary. They don't actually mean that much if you don't apply any specificity to them. So how they work is really incumbent upon citizens from all corners, whether it's academics and researchers, kind of exposing different practices and thinking about ways in which to kind of hold accountable companies and to measure how algorithms are working, to look for bias and so forth. Whether it's citizens on the ground pushing for greater privacy for their data, or putting in lawsuits when it comes to copyright infringement linked to large language models. This is a very unsettled terrain. It is. There are very few rules at the moment, and that won't last forever. So in this definitional period, particularly when there isn't settled law in any way about what the norms of use ought to be and what the safeguards are, having citizens weigh in actively in terms of exposing abuses, coming up with ideas for use and so forth is critical. So I'd say more than anything, it is up to citizens right now, certainly until we kind of get some catch up when it comes to regulation, to be engaged.
Well, I think Karthik had a question that sort of relates to that to some extent, focusing on the global south. So I'm going to invite him to ask a question real quick. And then I have one technical question for you about your AI Global Index, out of curiosity after Karthik asks his question.
Sure.
If Karthik's there. Karthik, did I put you on the spot?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hi, Stephen. Great talk. So coming from India, I come from a city called Chennai, and I think last year they started installing surveillance cameras, and I was kind of getting a general sense that people are actually welcoming sort of the installation of those cameras in the general context of increased security, right? In a city that is probably not safe from in the night, I guess, with increased crime and all that. So for people who are sort of on the edge, who are not directly interacting with the police, they feel that it's secure. And for people who are probably interacting with the police on a day-to-day basis, they are probably not aware of sort of the intrusion of AI or surveillance technologies into their rights, into their lives. Sort of they're not connecting the dots probably. So in that sense, how do you foresee sort of the public working within the democracy space to sort of challenge these intrusion of human rights and sort of privacy rights? Is probably education a way forward? I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there's two ways to kind of think about it and challenge it. So the first thing that I think is really interesting is that if you look at the data so far, and it's not complete, but all the studies that have taken place when it comes to associated crime levels and the installation of smart surveillance systems, there is little to no correlation at all, or relationship between the two. In other words, that even if people think or feel like these cameras make them safer, the evidence says it doesn't change crime rates. And so I think over time, that evidence will make its way in and begin, can provoke a sharper debate about what is the point of these cameras if the same level of crime prior to the installation of these systems still exists after they've been established. I think the second thing too is that as citizens ask more questions, as these technologies become less novel, and they start to kind of realize different other uses for these systems in terms of collecting information about and tracking where individuals particularly are going, or what they're communicating or what they're saying, all of which there are instances of that taking place in India right now. I think they'll start to ask questions about the balance, about the trade-offs in terms of the supposed public safety utility of these systems combined with the very real deprivations of political liberties. And public order rationales are time-honored, very well-trodden arguments used to justify the installation of surveillance, whether it's these AI systems or something else, or spyware. And rarely is there as much of a connection as the authorities would have it appear.
Thank you, Stephen, for your response.
Hey, John, I think you're muted, but I know you had a question.
Sorry, someone in the Q&A is interested in whether we might be able to get copies of your slides afterward. And I wanted to ask you if you could reopen your third slide on global presence of AI-powered surveillance technologies for a sec.
Sure. Yeah, let me do that.
And while you're doing that, I'll also make a pitch for an interactive map that you created at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, called, I think it was your model of your AI Global Index. And so I'd come across that first before I saw this slide. And I've been wondering as I look at these maps, I know you're focused on firms, where the firms came from in the AI Global Index more than looking at it sort of by country. So where the AI technology was exported from, let's say. But when you're considering firms in this global context, are you looking largely at where they're headquartered or where they were incorporated, or do you consider who's on the board of directors of these firms, which would give you, many countries, maybe China and US boards of directors or members of the board, in one firm? And then how do you sort of sort this into this map?
Yeah. Well, actually, this is slightly different. What this shows is just which countries around the world have acquired different systems, right? So if you have a color on there, it essentially says that there is some evidence that you have procured a system, whether it's from Huawei or another company, at some point. And so what I did kind of more specifically within the index that you're mentioning is that I then broke it down and linked them to companies. So when I found like the incident, the event, I would then sort of name the company, and then I would also associate that with the country of origin. And so I started to go down the road, and this is slightly older research for me. I'd started to go down the road in terms of looking at shareholders and areas of incorporation and so forth. And there's been a number of interesting papers that have come out on that question in terms of like looking at Huawei and its shareholder structure, for example. And the bottom line, is that it's very opaque, and it's hard to know exactly to what degree there is direct control or members on the board of directors who are, assigned by the CCP. But there certainly seems to be evidence that that is the case. And there's also a little bit unclear in terms of what direct subsidies, particularly Chinese companies, have when it comes to money directly being given, by the state to subsidize a range of different investments and so forth. And that's by design. They don't want to sort of disclose that. So, I would say that remains to me something that is worth a continued push to better understand. I've looked a little bit about this in a slightly related area in terms of spyware companies, in terms of where they're incorporated and where some of the money is coming from. But it's tough, pretty difficult work, and actually makes for some interesting kind of research if you know of people or you yourself would be of interest, would want to take that.
I will talk to you about that more. We've been doing a little bit of this work at Movement Engage, so and I know it's very time consuming and very difficult. Plus, trying to track where the data is going afterwards starts to, I think, reinforce your point that it's a blurry line between these autocracies and democracies to some extent, in thinking about how these intrusive technologies in particular are to be mapped in terms of their effects. So you don't have to just have the technology operating in your country, being used by your country in a more nefarious way or a more invasive way. It can also be extracted, some of that data, for uses in other countries and then used again at election time, for instance, as we've seen within our country. But anyway, I want to open this up a little bit more to some questions. I see we have quite a few now. Karthik, have you been filtering these?
Yeah. So one question relates to sort of how to sort of combat technologies at an individual level rather than looking at from an institutional perspective, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Well, that sort of, I guess, would give you kind of an individual answer. In that it depends. So look, one of the things that you can do is you can start with privacy, and you can say, what are steps that, so if you're worried about your data being used in ways that go beyond your consent, there are steps you can take to protect yourself. Frankly, steps I take these days to sort of, detoxify your digital presence online to ensure that you have better control over your data. So that means, for example, the grand bargain with social media companies is that you get free access and they get to take everything and that all your information and monetize it. So you can deplatform yourself from social media platforms, and that'll help go a long way. For me personally, at this point, I'm really only just on a handful of places, and I'm debating these days, really with Twitter, given its kind of descent, whether that's even worth staying on anymore. I am still for now, but Many others I just don't participate in at all. So that helps. When you chat, talk to people, use encrypted apps. Use Signal. That's a great one. When you use your email, you use Gmail. Gmail harvests your data, and then you get personalized ads. Don't use Gmail. Use Proton. So there are a lot of basic things like that, especially on the privacy enhancement side. That even small steps in terms of making choices that you have about what browsers you use. So another thing, I use Brave, which has privacy enhancing technologies. I don't use Chrome or some of the others. That's another one that helps quite a bit. There are alternatives out there. It takes a minute to research those and look for them, but that can help a lot. And for those, especially who are calling in or watching from the United States, despite all the concerns that we have, I mean, there are lots of ways to push back, to work within the legal system or political system for change. Many less options in other countries, whether it's hybrid regimes or whether it's certainly authoritarian. So, if you're calling from the United States, we're lucky in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. There are two other questions that are kind of trying to speculate what the possibilities for AI. One sort of relates to the risks involved in AI becoming more autonomous and autonomous decision making of AI. The second sort of question is, what would you rate as sort of the top most amazing effect of AI 10 years from now, sort of the impact, I guess, of AI?
That's a futurist.
Yeah, right. I was going to say that's less my area of my discipline. I can offer a few ideas that probably won't turn true. In terms of question on autonomy, in terms of, I guess, what's the question about that? Is it that, how does that, what is my concern when it comes to autonomy?
Yeah, probably
I think
risks involved.
What are the risks? I mean, there's all sorts of risks, right? I mean, it's the idea that essentially what is autonomy? It's it goes beyond the control of an individual human in terms of decisions that are made algorithmically to distribute information. And with generative AI, it's not just distributing information, it's generating new content. So what if that new content turns negative, turns bad, as we've already seen in different kind of scenarios, right? How far does that extend? How far does that go? What is the propaganda potential? What if the humans who are guiding the algorithm have bad intent in mind? Let's say they work for propaganda outlets associated with Russia, which surely they do, and surely they're already trying to exploit this information. And then kind of that sort of initiates a takeoff from the algorithm that generates even more worse misinformation, disinformation. I mean, you can just sort of spin out how these scenarios would take you. Not to mention all the autonomy questions related to war fighting as well, something that I've been kind of looking into a bit, especially in the context of the Ukraine war. And then what I think is the most amazing, in 10 years, that AI will help us solve climate change. It will come up with the right innovations that we somehow can't get around or overcome the hurdles that we have from the fossil fuel industry and come up with an amazing invention that'll help us put the brakes on temperatures rising around the globe.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've kept you to the end of your time. We do have a link that Karthik's going to put in the chat for folks who want to see the recording of this webinar, and also there's a short survey for those of you who would be willing to fill it out, and Karthik will put that in the chat as well. Stephen, thank you again so much for being with us today and telling us about your research. I think you also have an article. You said that you might want us to put in the chat as well, an upcoming article to draw people's attention to.
Oh yeah. Well, it's not out yet, but it's forthcoming. So I will. So unfortunately, I can't share it now because I don't have a link. It will be open access for.
Excellent. Yeah. Where would we find?
And then I'll send it to you, and you can just circulate it once it comes out.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Yeah, it'd be great.
All right. Karthik, any last words?
No, thank you so much. It was really enlightening for a lot of us, given that AI has been in the forefront of news in the past 2 months, at least with ChatGPT in the so thanks so much for enlightening us about this, and it makes us think, I guess, more.
Yeah, well, thanks for hosting me. I really appreciate it. And lots of good engagement and a really nice audience. So thanks, John. Thanks, Karthik. And let's be in touch.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. See you later.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.